Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the fourth entry in the HyperMu DevLog series, where I'm excited to talk about how HyperMu works on the limits of suspension travel. HyperMu is a multi-body vehicle dynamic simulation written from scratch in Python. Intuitively, HyperMu is a virtual shaker rig, but with greater functionality. It can replay lateral and longitudinal g-forces, synthetic or captured from telemetry, through a vehicle model's center of mass, which can give a much more complete representation of what the tires are experiencing over the duration of a lap. So, for this reason, I sometimes think of it as a 7+2 post virtual shaker rig. HyperMu focuses on predicting values critical to vehicle performance, but that are impossible to directly measure in race conditions, like instantaneous tire load. In this video, I want to demonstrate HyperMu's simulation of bump stops and travel limits, and how it can help us understand something about a chassis model's behavior, which is generally much less intuitive than other tuning options. Compared to springs or sway bars, for example, which for the most part act consistently throughout all phases of the corner, it's much harder to know exactly when each of the many bump stops are engaged and how they're affecting the grip levels and the oversteer-understeer balance of a car. So here's the problem statement. The vehicle model I've demonstrated in previous videos has excessive suspension travel and actually bottoms out several times throughout the telemetry replay simulation. Looking at the new suspension travel plots that we have in HyperMu, suspension displacement in meters over time and bump stop force in newtons over time, we see that the suspension bottoms out twice during this run. The first event happens towards the end here, and you can see that the front right and the front left suspension, where these vertical red bars are, represents a crash with whatever the suspension travel limit is. It doesn't necessarily need to be the end of the damper travel. It could be a collision between the body of the vehicle and the road. That's up to the user to define. But in this case, whatever that limit is, it is being reached here with both the front and left and right. So this is a heave mode suspension limit collision. And we have another example here where it's only the front left side. So this is in a roll mode. And keep in mind, so far, all of the data gathered here is on an autocross run with a nominally flat track surface. So we're not even talking about curb strikes yet. All this has just been done under the vehicle's own G-forces on a flat surface. So all of this is a problem because bottoming out suspension components like this can be dangerous by binding them together and suddenly reducing drivability, or just breaking and bending the suspension components. So we need to eliminate the suspension reaching the end of its travel. The aim in this video will be to do this without disrupting the chassis model's existing mechanical balance, which we can also estimate in HyperMu as the lateral load transfer ratio, which is the blue trace in the bottom right-hand corner here. Additionally, we want to do this without relying on the bump stops too much for roll and pitch control. Some racing series might use bump stops as a chassis balancing tool, but be aware that engaging the bump stops too aggressively, too quickly, in many contexts can lead to unpredictable load transfers on the tires. So we don't want to engage it more than we need to. And finally, before we start, I'd like to remind everybody that HyperMu is still experimental, unvalidated software. So any tuning changes we talk about in this video are academic, and nobody should be applying changes to their cars based on results from these videos. This is just a software demo. It's not tuning advice. So all that said, let's get started. So getting started here, you've seen me in previous videos have the Python command ready to go in a terminal, and I run them directly from the terminal for you, but there is a lot of information to go through for this video, which I won't be able to juggle in the terminal. So we have everything written out in a Python file here, and we'll cycle through it. What we've seen already covers the creation of the baseline vehicle model, the one that does reach the end of its travel, potentially causing the binding or the braking suspension components, and we were just looking at its predicted basic shaker results. We have a candidate model that we want to look at here, but before we skip to that one, I want to make note of the very first candidate model that I looked at, which was increasing the front ride height. After some iteration, I found that 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters of increased front ride height would be enough to predict that the vehicle model is no longer touching its stops. However, there were a lot of regressions in the vehicle handling, which couldn't be compensated for. At the end of the day, increasing the center of mass height, as you would do if you increase the front suspension travel, simply can't be compensated for in terms of regaining the additional lateral load transfers, at least in the steady state. So that model, even though it solved our problem uh, of clearing the suspension travel, and that should always be the first of clearing, making sure the suspension travel cleared the limits, which should always be the first goal. There are better ways to go about doing this. So we're going to skip the option where we're increasing the front ride height, and we're going to go to this candidate option, which is increasing the front spring rates. After some iterative testing, I found that it was necessary to increase the front spring rate from 450 pounds to 550. 500 itself was not quite enough. This seems like a pretty significant change. It's an 11% increase in the ride frequency. So if the vehicle model is very sensitive to changes in the relative front rear pitch frequencies, that's probably describing a vehicle model with a flat underfloor and therefore a very sensitive aero map or something. There might need to be a more considered approach, but this vehicle model is not very aerodynamically sensitive, so we'll go ahead with the 550-pound springs on the front for this demonstration. Increasing the spring rate at the front is going to introduce understeer and make our lateral load transfer ratio front to rear increase. And we want to make sure that we're compensating for that. So we've done that by decreasing the front roll bar rate as well from 160 down to 130 pounds per relative inches of wheel displacement. And finally, to make sure that the front axle is now not oversprung and underdamped, we've made adjustments to the damping ratios of the front dampers as well. All of these changes are going to be created into a vehicle model here. And after that, we'll look at its behavior by itself, make sure that it clears the suspension travel limits, and then finally compare its behavior and lateral load transfer to the baseline vehicle model. So let's go ahead and do that. There's two things to pay attention to in this plot, mainly that we are clear of reaching the suspension travel limits with the candidate model, meaning there's no vertical bars on the red vertical bars on the suspension displacement chart, and the bump stop activity is still present but reduced. You can see that the maximum force is less than the 750 or so that we saw in the baseline model. So let's go ahead and compare it to the baseline model now. Okay, so the baseline model will be represented with orange traces and the orange histograms, and the blue will represent the spring rate change that we just performed. Looking at the lateral load distribution on the front and the rear axle, we could see that the standard deviation has been decreased a little bit, which is generally a good indicator of increasing the grip potential on that axle, but it's by a relatively small number. We can see that on the rear, the mean lateral load transfer has decreased, but it increased very marginally on the front. The lateral load distribution ratio, meanwhile, has the exact same standard deviation, and the candidate model has a very, very slightly greater understeer bias, greater numbers are understeer bias compared to the baseline model, but it's almost exactly in the same ballpark. And importantly, what we're not seeing here is the significant regressions that we did see with the elevated front ride height, where both the mean and the standard deviation of the lateral load transfer on the front and the rear axles was greater, indicating a lower grip potential on those axles. Looking on the longitudinal load distribution, we see that the change to spring, damper, and sway bar rates ended up being a very slight regression for the mean, very slight improvement for the standard deviation. It's mostly a wash. And I should also mention that the longitudinal load distribution is one area where the increase in front ride height was actually an improvement. But overall, looking at this plot, it's safe to say that we have a candidate model whose predicted performance will not cause any significant regressions, keep the chassis balance roughly the same in terms of oversteer, understeer, predict that the front suspension will not reach the end of its travel. So we could end the video here, but there is one more thing that we could do to optimize the candidate model, and it's a really good opportunity to demonstrate how HyperMu reacts to different kinds of bump stop engagements. I'm talking about increasing the rear bump stop activity, because in both of the models that we've seen so far, there has been no rear bump stop activity at all. We would expect increasing the rear bump stop activity to increase the lateral load transfer on the rear axle, help create a little bit more oversteer balance in some cases to counteract the effects of stiffening the front springs and dampers. And it'll be a really good way to show how that bump stop activity is calculated inside HyperMu. So what we do to create that vehicle model is to lower the value describing the compression to the rear bump stop. This will just mean that when the suspension compresses, it's activated sooner, and that'll all be encoded into this vehicle model here. We're going to look at this bump stop model by itself, and then we're going to compare the tire response and the lateral load transfer to the original baseline model. So let's go ahead and do that. So two things to look at here. Once again, we clear the suspension travel limits and we see that the rear bump stops are much more active. The peak rear bump stop activation is not as many newtons as the peak front, even though the rear left bump stop is quite active towards the end of the simulation run here. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, we don't want to rely on bump stops too much as a tuning tool, but for demonstration purposes in this video, we'll go ahead with this configuration as it is. Once again, looking at these suspension changes, everything in orange is the baseline change where we did have the suspension bottoming out, and everything in blue is the candidate change with the increased engagement of the rear bump stops. We can see that in every corner of the suspension, there is a decrease in the candidate's standard deviation, which is suggesting to us that there is a very slightly lower contact patch load variation, which is an indicator of higher grip potential on each tire individually. So we can be optimistic for a positive result when we're going to look at the load transfer detail plots. And finally, looking at our spring rate change with extra rear bump stop activation versus the very first baseline. Again, baseline in orange, the candidate setup in blue. The results initially are very positive for lateral load distribution. On the front axle, the mean is lower and the standard deviation is lower, which indicates more grip potential on the front axle. Same story with the rear axle, lower mean, lower standard deviation, greater grip potential. For the lateral load distribution ratio, the candidate and the baseline have the same mean, which means that on average, there's going to be the same oversteer, understeer balance contributed by the mechanical platform, springs, bump stops, dampers, and sway bars. So this means that in terms of the oversteer, understeer balance, the candidate is now as close as we can match using this tool to the baseline model. However, the standard deviation is lower. So making a broad generalization here, the oversteering moments are going to feel less oversteering. The understeering moments are going to feel more less understeering. So generally, the car might feel the chassis model is predicted to feel more neutral overall. So it's actually a slight improvement now that we've engaged the rear bump stops for the lateral mode. And for the longitudinal mode, again, very slight regression on the mean, very slight improvement on the standard deviation. It's a wash for the lateral, for the longitudinal case. But generally, I think we can say that this vehicle model with increased front spring rate, increased front dampers, softened front anti-roll bar, and increased rear bump stop engagement has produced an improvement in a very modest improvement in the lateral mode, probably not a significant regression in the longitudinal mode, and most critically, it's predicted to keep the car off of its suspension travel limits, preventing suspension breakages and binding. So that concludes everything I have to share for this video. So thank you so much if you've watched it this far. I'm really enjoying making these videos, and I have lots of new ideas, lots of new video ideas, including a big correlation update with some new sensors, and I want to do a deep dive on some of the Pythonic things that have gone under the hood of HyperMu to make it solve faster, and some kind of quality assurance checks under the hood as well. So please stay tuned, and thank you so much for watching this far. See you soon.